Again, today, backed by always popular demand on Thought Rock Live, we have Graham Furnis, who's a senior consultant at the Wyze Group. Graham Furnis is fully immersed and passionate in providing ITSM solutions. He is a business-driven IT professional with 20-plus years of technology and management experience. Graham is certified as an ITIL manager and expert, as well as an accredited ITIL instructor. Graham will talk to you a little bit more about the highlights of today's session. I'm going to turn it over to Graham. Graham.
Great. Well, thank you, Rick and Wanda. And thank you, everyone, for joining in for 2012. Start of another year, and anyone keeping track would know last year I started off 2011 with a change presentation as well. So seems a good way to start off, and always an interesting topic and one that I love in the whole transition side of the ITIL framework. So today's topic is based upon the new 2011 refresh of ITIL, and titled Has Change Changed? And so we'll take a look at some of the areas where there's been a few updates within the change process. And I'll leave it up to you at the end to assess for yourself, has it really changed or just become a bit more clarified? So hopefully there's a bit more discussion we can have with the presentation today. Just going over the quick agenda to give you a heads up of really four main areas I'm going to cover. Just in case we have some people not too familiar with the change process or looking for some overall insight, we'll start off just reviewing the overall change process itself, doing a quick top-down and once-over of what it's all about. Look at service change types, always an important thing to drive your change activity and process. Compare the normal change models and the authorization step. And then during that comparison, we can have actually a bit of a discussion during those slides and leave some time for more questions and wrap up and comments at the end. So let's get started with the first piece. Let's go in the overall coverage of what the change process is all about. In essence, it hasn't changed. So if I jump to my next slide, let's just start from the beginning and make sure we're all on the same page and know what perspective I'm coming from when doing this presentation. So the key things here, any type of change is based around configuration items in the ITIL wording, and it's any type of addition, modification, or removal of one of these configuration items. So then it takes us down to the next part of my slide. What is a configuration item? If you don't know what your configuration items are, then you don't know what you're actually trying to put change controls on. So the standard definition for configuration items is really three main pieces here. It's any type of supported IT service. And within that IT service, you've got hardware and software components, the technology that actually makes that service come to life, and includes associated critical documentation. It's not meant to be a knowledge management system. It's just the critical documentation for delivering service. So these are the main things that make up our configuration items. And a quick question for you, Rick, just to get your perspective. Out of these three main definitions for what a configuration item is composed of, which do you think is the one where most companies and organizations focus the most?
I hope I get this right. I think it would be components.
And bingo, you would be correct. Certainly this is where most of the critical pieces are located. You know, if we did a tree diagram of configuration items, so services at the top, and then hundreds and thousands of components potentially link underneath that service of a technical nature that delivers it. So I'm not saying that the other two service or documentation pieces of a configuration item aren't important, but certainly the most important thing we try and get control of when controlling the addition, modification, or removal of a configuration item are those technical components, because those are the things that we change, they break, we fix, and that's what the business driver is for the change process. So that leads to a third part of this slide. So your overall scope in just the overall change management process, it's not to be taken lightly. You need to really think about what is it I need to get control of, and how much time and effort and complexity will I undertake trying to get that under some type of management control. So the standard way, if you're starting from scratch, start small and increase that scope over time. And then here's a good point which should make everyone think for a little bit. I would say that you should always be aiming for an enterprise-wide type of scope. The way that IT and infrastructure is put together, it's an incredibly complex environment, only getting more complex. You have internal and external service providers and components, and someone can make a change on a desktop completely separate from a server group or an application group, but somehow later on down the road they go and roll out an application, and for that one particular user or group, it doesn't work, right? We get a failure, and that's because we had no idea that something was changed on the desktop. So we don't know how things might be connected, and the goal of change management is to be controlling all configuration items throughout the organization, so that those things we don't think will have any impact can be identified and managed and controlled. Okay, so that's just a quick once-over just to give a sense of the change management process. And we're usually starting off with the technical and software components, and looking at an enterprise-wide type of approach with a small scope of what we're trying to get for details, and then we try and grow that and build on our successes over time. So the next piece, too, just to, again, bring our perspectives of what I think change is all about. So what we're trying to do when we're controlling changes, we're looking for some type of way to make beneficial changes with minimal disruption to the business. So for those people who are familiar with change and the ITIL process, you'll be familiar with these terms, especially minimal disruption. But the key thing there is that you want beneficial changes. So as part of your way of assessing and managing changes, we need to understand what they're all about and what they're trying to achieve and should they be done. And everything here falls under really risk management. This is the way I view and approach change management. Everything's about trying to figure out what's important and needs to be done, what are the risks associated with it, and how can we try and manage those risks. So that's a good focus to make real progress in your change process. So then the second point of this is that having a change control process in your organization will give you structure to all of your changes and releases going out the door. And we're always business focused in the real and ITIL world, so we're looking at a benefit of cost and time savings, and then we're really looking for this other benefit here, higher volumes of changes overall. So we need to get out of, if your company is currently in a cycle of change, break, fix, and that's a lot of time and effort and cost associated with that, we want to get out of that break, fix type of cycle. And that'll allow us to spend more time on doing more important and business value type of changes. Okay, so that's really what the change process is all about, and again, what we're trying to achieve from a results point of view. So then we get into some key considerations, and I just went across the process and jotted down some key points which I could talk around and discuss a little bit. So going back to, it's kind of connected to the previous slide. So the purpose of change management is that we need to manage risks whenever we go in and make a change, because on average, it could be 70 to 80% of all changes out there tend to in some way fail. So ITIL is very clear and always has been. This isn't new. It's not part of the ITIL refresh, but no change is without risk, right? So every time you make a change, even if you think it shouldn't have any type of implications, it's only a small change, there's always a risk it might fail. And the way that we manage risk, because you can't eliminate risk. It's there no matter what. So the way we try and manage it, the key thing here is remediation and backup plans. And from an ITIL perspective, part of the change process as a check or an audit type of process is to make sure when a change is going through, have we thought about how do we lessen the impact should it fail, and how do we back it out and go back to square one? So it's one of the key success factors. If you're not looking at this, you should be, because that's right up there where the auditors take their first look when they look at your audit, change process. So then we get to the next piece, which is, okay, well, now we have to understand if we want to make beneficial changes with minimal disruption to the business, how are we going to assess this change to know if it's beneficial or not? So the ways that we assess change, everyone should be familiar with this from an ITIL background. Priority equals impact and urgency. So that's a standard way of prioritizing my tickets and knowing from a business impact point of view, these are the things that need to be done as soon as possible. You need to have a separate risk assessment, which will then connect back here to the remediation and backup plans. And you need a business case to justify whether or not this is a beneficial change. So you need to go through and look at the benefits and costs of doing each change. And of course, the amount of time and effort you do in all this will scale up and down depending upon how big and critical the changes that you're doing. And in different situations, based upon the business environment and the goals and objectives of your process, there's other things we could add into the assessment to understand what we're dealing with when we deal with each change. So these are the bare minimums. The other sort of key consideration or point, and this is one which was mentioned in the old version of ITIL. It's something which I've always talked about in practice whenever I've done change activities, and it's still there in the new version, or the updated 2011 version. So we have multiple authorization points. I know before when I've talked to people or I've been asked questions or seen different change processes, it appeared that you have one CAB meeting, everyone says go ahead, and we're off to the races. That never was the case, and we'll see that there's been some clarification around this point in the new 2011 version. So going down our list, some other key considerations, and this one I would say is, I'll even put a little star beside it here. This is a very critical one, change models. The best way to describe a change model is when you find something that works and you have it documented, then use those documented steps when you do the same type of change or identical change over and over again. So we can plan it out ahead of time, or we can just identify those things that have worked well in the past and make those our change models. It's basically just a way of going through and saying, again, if you know you found something that works well, stick with it, and by repeating that, this will help minimize up here these risks. So a critical piece of the change management process is to go back and assess what are we doing well and how do we keep doing it. The change schedule, for people involved in change management, this should be one of your, it's almost a Bible. Knowing all the changes that are coming up and going through, making that available to all of the other ITIL processes, especially incident and problem management, request fulfillment potentially. It should always be available to your service desk because, of course, that old cycle of change, break, fix makes this such a critical thing, and it's critical for coordinating and timing, which we'll see is those words show up all the time when we talk about change management. So you definitely need to have this change schedule under control and within your grasp. And the next major piece here is that as much as possible, another little star here, windows to allow us to do changes on components and regular updates to releases of critical services and applications. We're trying to set the expectation we have with our end customers and users, and also set a schedule internally to let us know when we can do maintenance and update work on the components. that support those services. So, out of the change process, these are just the ones that I thought would stand out a little bit and give us a chance of saying, if you focus on these things and add it into your change practice, these are the things that really I've found in the past give good dividend to success in doing your change activity. Okay, so that's basically the quick overview to the change process. So again, we're just trying to make beneficial changes with minimal disruption to the business. These considerations on this page will help you get focused to say these are good things I should be doing and incorporate into my change practices. And again, I should be doing this for all changes across the organization because, again, you never know what's connected to what. And if there's silos of change management, there's going to be a lot of things which happen external to a group under control, and you won't know what's happened because you haven't got the audit trail that change records create. So in my next slide, we go down to another piece which is also a key consideration for the change process, and it has something new here. I've even got a little new button that shows up on the right side. So officially in the ITIL documentation, they still talk about the three types of changes: normal, emergency, and standard. But then they go on to talk quite often in different places about major changes. So this is really, in my view, just another change type. And actually what a major change is just a more significant normal change. But in the way that they've updated the ITIL concepts and some of the diagrams, this really should be, I think, listed here as one of the change types. So the basic definition of a major change is that, again, it's a normal change, but it's significant impact in some way. So it's fairly big, complicated, or highly visible to the business or critical to business operations. Whatever it might be, the major change is quite high in scope. And we'll see that as we go through a few other of the updates, this plays out a little bit in some of the updated diagrams and concepts. So we need to pay more attention to major changes. I think that's why ITIL put this in the refresh update. The more major the change, the slower we should go, the more assessment we should do, and the more proper planning and testing we should do with this. So then we get down to, again, just a quick overview in case people aren't familiar with it. So then we get down to normal changes. So a normal change, again, a major change is just a significant normal change. And the rest of the normal changes then would be more moderate or intermediate sort of level changes that are happening. So we want to make sure that for any change which needs some type of assessment, some type of broad stakeholder review, this comes into the change process for central assessment and control. Right? We want to make sure we have a change record and that everyone who potentially is going to be impacted by the change has a chance to review it and make recommendations for success. Now I'll skip over emergency changes for a minute. The other thing at the bottom here, standard definition for change management, standard changes. So these are my pre-approved and delegated types of changes. And don't underestimate the power of standard changes. These are things which don't need to come into the change process. So change management doesn't review, and in my opinion, and the ITIL books support it, shouldn't review evaluating every single change that goes on in your organization. There are small things that are done. You might be deciding to track changes at very low level of changing toner in a printer. Maybe doing regular patch updates for Microsoft Office products on desktops. These are all things which you do on a regular basis. If they've been tried and tested and shown to have minimal, if not next to no, negative impacts over time, then these are things that don't need to come into the change process every single time. We want to make them standard delegated changes. Someone's going to create a a ticket. There's still a ticket for it that goes into your ticketing system, but instead of being a change record that comes through and is assessed by change management, these standard changes are simply left in the system. They're approved by a delegated local manager somewhere who says, go ahead, these are the standard changes that we're authorized to approve. Follow these standard procedures, and when you're done, make sure there's a record and a document trail.
Hey, Graham, just a quick question from someone twittering. 70% change failure rate. Did they hear that correctly?
Yeah, the overall, it depends on the company and how you measure change, but roughly speaking, change failure has always been in the 70 to 80% range. And that's just average numbers. Again, you're going to baseline for everyone out there in a change department or process. You're going to set your own benchmarks and baselines based upon how you're going to start your scope and your measuring activity, and from there you'll start to make your improvements and get that number down. And I won't get into too detailed a conversation about the failure rate. You can really change your metrics and your failure rates based upon how you define the change types and how you start reporting on important failures versus just overall failures. Right? Small things like changing toner in a printer, causing a failure because it wasn't quite put in right or something and had to be taken out and put back in. You know, that's not as important as changing a server and bringing down emails for a day. So anyway, that being said, it's up to the change process. Again, focus on the metrics that mean the most. So going back to our change types then, again, major changes is just a new version or type of change, which is a significant normal change. Then we have our normal changes, our standard changes, and then in the middle here, we have our emergency changes. So these are things which, you know, it's got high business impact. Something has failed. So it's not an emergency if the business is shouting, we need it today because we need this new functionality in an application. That would be an urgent normal change. An emergency change is linked to the incident management process, and therefore something has failed, has a high business impact, and we need to make a quick fix. So your process flows will change a bit for that one because you don't want to slow things down with a lot of documentation and bureaucracy. Things need to move forward. You need to have people on conference call, and you kind of document as you go and get verbal authorization to proceed. So again, I've done other presentations, and you can, at the end of the presentation here, you know, I'll show you a little slide that you can search up some of the other presentations and blogs I've written. But it's very critical to manage your emergency changes very tightly and in conjunction with incident management because when you have a major incident, that's going to trigger over here to an emergency change. Okay, so we have our major and significant normal change. And if I go to my next slide here, then we have our, you know, where's our basic information coming from? So I'm going to start from the bottom on this screen. So the change record. So the change record is your ticket. It's going to be in your ticketing system. Contains all information about the change that people need to be able to access and you can do all your metrics later on. So in that change record, the request for change is either a form or other types of details that may be entered directly into the change record. It tells you the details of the actual change. And it's more technical details. Here's the things we're going to change. These are the components. These are the services involved. Here's our initial assessment of the risk and the impact. So that type of information is in the request for change. And this is required for all normal changes. So I'll put a big N beside it. And then if it's a major change, I wouldn't say it's new. It was in the old version of ITIL, but now it's more pronounced and talked about in the new ITIL, there we go, 2011 version. The change proposal. So what they've done with the change proposal, it's always been in the diagrams, but now they've linked it to the service portfolio management process, which it wasn't word by word matched to before. So the change proposal is on top of the RFC. So these things are kind of combined, and both of these are in some way attached to your change record. when you have a major change, it's fairly significant. You need to make sure you've done a proper business assessment of it, going back to that whole concept of beneficial change. So the change proposal, the way I like to think about it, it's a high-level business case. It tells you a lot more about why the change is being done and more about what the business impact should be. And these are other things that we need to know more about the reasons for the change in the first place and how it's going to affect the strategic area of the portfolio. So it's basically related. The change proposal is, they don't say it word for word, but I look at this and say the change proposal is needed for every major change, and then a request for change, that technical detail is needed for every normal change and major change, right? These things are added together. They're not one or the other. And then all of that information needs to be linked into your change record, so you have a single point of information that relates to every change you're doing. Okay, so now we can take all this. So these are the two new things that are basically talked about in the 2011 refresh. They've elaborated on the change proposal. They've linked it to the concept of a major change and a real business assessment being done in portfolio management. And then if I go down to this slide, and this is the one where I'll stick on this for a little bit and just have some discussion. So here's where they've changed the change flow diagrams from the 2011 version of ITIL and the 2011. And here's a real hard question, Rick. So looking at these two diagrams, what stands out to you as being the area that seems to have changed within the change process?
Well, let me think if I can do some color coordinating here. I think if we look at the tan boxes on the right-hand side, it looks like they are replacing change authorization and plan updates on the left.
Yeah. So you can see there's quite a difference in when I matched up the activity steps. There's quite a difference here when what used to be just authorize a change and then go ahead and do your plan updates. They've now broken that apart. And actually, just a small thing too, I'll mention near the end. They also have taken away a box, right? We used to have evaluation report, and now they've removed it. So let me go through and talk about a few of these things. The way the diagrams are done, I just took a copy. In the blue circles, these are the roles that would be typically doing the activity steps. I've kind of combined at the top of the screen. You've got your change proposals, right? We just talked about that. You need your change proposals for all of your major changes, and then you need to have an RFC to detail a bit more of the technical aspects of what you're doing with each change. So just running through these, the initiator is the one who is the one requesting the change and is going to be doing the change. So they're going to put together the change proposal and the RFC. Might be a project team doing this. They're going to record the RFC into your ticketing system, and I highly recommend you make sure they do it, because otherwise your change process will be forever documenting someone else's work. And then change management takes over in the same places here. They're going to review the RFC. And this first step of review there's no assessment done here. It's just a quick look and once over to make sure, do we have all the information we need to properly assess the change and be able to understand what the change is all about. And they're also making sure as well, I like the way that one of the words has been cleaned up in ITIL in 2011. They start using the word authorize. Before in the books, it used to flip between approval and authorization. So now they talk about here authorize is, several places down below. So one of the things we do, though, when we're reviewing the RFC, if we're in the change process, here if you want to make sure that someone's submitting a change and somewhere a business manager has said it's approved to be done, right? That someone isn't just making up their mind that, oh, we're gonna reorganize our servers and we're going to upgrade all of them, right? You don't just submit that to the change process and then the change manager looks at it and says, oh, that's a good idea. They're going to review the RFC to find out who's the actual sponsor and approver of this change. Is it someone who is on my list of authorized approvers within different technical areas. So, so approval is done up here. We make sure that we're not going to go any further until we know we're doing something that needs to be done for some type of reason, and we have a sponsor and approver. We've got all the information we need. Now we go ahead and we do the assessment and evaluation. So here's where now we're trying to understand the priority, the risk, what real business benefits are being sought from this, and what kind of cost. And is this a major change? Is it just a normal change? Should this, is it so low level that we should spawn this off and make it a pre-approved standard change? So this is all of the assessment pieces here. And then we get into these sort of tan-colored boxes, which is the elaboration of what used to be over here, right? We just, let's assume we have a normal change that's a significant enough level that goes to the CAB. So we always associated the CAB and the overall stakeholder map meeting at the authorization part. So here we do the same thing, except what was never very clear before, if you're dealing with a CAB, the CAB is actually, let me see, roughly here in terms of its scope. It's not just the change process and change manager who should be doing the assessment and evaluation. Whoever's going to eventually be authorizing to move to the next step, which could be your CAB, would also be part of that assessment. Right? Everyone has an input to say, well, here's some risks you might not have thought of, and here's some priorities you may not have thought about. So that hasn't changed, but just in terms of clarity, it's a bit more clear now that the CAB is involved not just at this one spot right here, but it's actually across all the different points of authorization and assessment. So what we do now, and what I like about the change process diagram being updated, I've always talked about there's always multiple checkpoints within the change process, especially the more you get up to a major type of change. So at each step, you want to have, let's call it a consideration and take a step back and have a look at how things are going to make sure that before we get down to the end here of deploying and potentially destroying our production environment, we're going through, and the more risky and big the change is, the slower we go and the more checks and balances we have. So now we have, as our first step of authorization, what the CAB would do in this scenario. They authorize the change to go into the build and test step of things. Right? So again, change management won't do these steps. They'll pass it off to a release or some type of technical team to do the actual build and test. And then that's just the authorization to proceed. Then they're going to come back and let's say it's your release teams doing the build and test. They're going to make sure things are done according to a time schedule. And at the end of that time schedule, they're going to send the results back here to the CAB. Okay, here we've built or acquired our different components, and we've come in on time, or maybe we're a bit delayed. We've done our testing. And here's our test plans and our test results, and our testing shows that we're compliant to what we've set up as being our first risk check. So then the CAB says, great. Part of your change process is that you don't move ahead until the CAB has reviewed these things, and they give the next authorization. Right? So again, there's multiple authorization points, and this is something which is much more clear in ITIL 2011. So now you have the authorization to go ahead and do your change deployment. So now, let's say again, it's the release and deployment process. They can go ahead and start putting together. They've already got the release, the deployment plans, and they're going to start putting the pieces out at a certain schedule. And they may have a pilot. They may have different user acceptance pieces going on. So while change is coordinating to make sure that the deployment is going as planned, they're going to ask for feedback, right? And it comes back again to the CAB. So let's have the CAB look at again, how's our deployment going, what's our sign-off and handover activities going. And we make sure everything is going good, and then we give the next authorization. We'll go ahead and we've done the deployment successfully, we're happy with it. So now we send it back to the change process to do the closure, and they may request different types of reviews and whatever it might be based upon how the change went. So what used to be done in the old version of ITIL here is still done. If you have an official evaluation process, or if just within your change process you have an evaluation report, the evaluation report is basically an easy way to think about it. After you do your basic testing, you always do your testing before and maybe after you deploy, certainly before, and you just make sure, okay, test environment gives these test results, production environment produces the same test results, everything looks pretty good. But then you need a more subjective, opinionated way of doing an evaluation. So you say, okay, well, let's take those test results and let's do an evaluation. This might go on, the bigger the change, the longer the evaluation goes on. And we won't close our change until we have an overall assessment or evaluation report saying it's good. Now the change can be closed. So I like what they've done with the new...
Hey, Graham, sorry, Graham,
yep.
Just one thing, Graham. Just want to do a quick. It's 12:40. Just want to do a quick time check because I know I've got access to seeing where we're going, and there's just to let everyone know if you've got schedule for this lunchtime. There is just really one more slide in the conclusion. So I think we will be wrapping up within the next 5 minutes. So I just want to do that quick time check for everybody so they know where we're going to be. But I think we have about another 5 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah, if that, because I'm pretty much done this one, and then, like you say, it's just one more slide.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Just keep going. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's good. And again, if you have questions or comments, you can just type them in, and Rick can interrupt me and ask your questions. So we're pretty much done with this. You can see where the changes are, and it's a good change within the overall process flow. So there's much more points and illustration of the fact that you give the authorization to proceed. People then go through and follow their time schedules and give the feedback back to the change process, and the change process will coordinate it with the CAB. And then at each significant step of build, test, and then deployment, you have these checks and balances to do the authorization. And over here, I would say, they took out the evaluation report. I would actually like to see it put back in, although you don't have to do that for every single type of change. It's more for the more major type of changes. I still like to see it there because it just makes you not forget that the bigger the change, the more you need to check it. So the last thing I'll say about these diagrams, one other small difference which is not highlighted, you notice over here, when rejecting a change, again, there's only one point of assessment or decision making, and if the change didn't work, it goes back and gets rejected to the initiators. Well, they have a lot more of these rejection points over on the 2011 diagram. So when we're doing the initial assessment and evaluation of the change, we may decide right here and there when our stakeholders look at it, this isn't a good change to be done. It's either got too much risk or it's not got enough benefit, whatever it might be. You might reject and close the change there and then. Once you start going through and you start doing the build and test, you might realize based upon test results or something isn't going as planned, and rather than sticking with it and going down and disrupting the production environment, you may reject it. And of course, after your testing, you may refuse to give authorization for deployment. Go back and you may have to do some rebuilds and testing because we don't like the results of what the testing is showing us. Okay, so again, a great addition to the diagram. There should always be a lot more of these. Whenever you have an option to authorize, you have an option to reject, and that's a basic rule. So the only last thing I have is at the CAB level here, they made a bit of an update, which I like, and that's my next slide. So
Graham, just before you move there's a couple of questions. Hopefully you can answer them right now, which might help.
Sure. Yeah.
From David, so what changes would you include under standard changes? For example, would you consider a server add a standard change? How have you seen this process integrated with agile development?
Oh, okay. Well, there's kind of two pieces there. In terms of dealing with server additions, again, it goes back to everything has to relate back to your organization. One company may have a bad history with server additions. Another company may have had no long-term issues. So the way that we do standard changes, it always goes back to saying, what's our history and what do we know? if we've never had significant issues about adding servers into our production environment, we've got a very defined procedure that we follow that's been successful over time. That's a good candidate for a standard change. And again, you may have a lot of procedures you have to follow, and a local manager makes sure you do that. But again, it can come out of the change process because it's not risky enough. If you've had success in the past and you're able to do these things at a local level, then make it a standard change. In terms of the Agile comment, well, that's an overall development kind of approach and concept, which can be used in a lot of different ways. But if you're doing things, you put a little bit out there, test it, get more requirements, come back and do more development, depending upon where, if you're talking about this from an application or an overall systems point of view. Those types of things are more project managed, and me personally, depending upon the situation, I'd like to see it more go through as a normal change to be assessed during the through the change process. The scope of how much it's going to be assessed will depend upon the potential relationships of what it's connecting to and what it might disrupt. Okay, so that's sort of the answer to that one. Okay, and just the last slide.
And one more from Eileen. Oh, sorry. There's just one more question from Eileen that might be related still to where we're at here. Isn't the benefit reviewed and approved in portfolio management?
Not all benefits. So if you have a major change, then it requires a higher level and business type of beneficial, build a business case. What are we trying to do and what's it trying to achieve? And then as you start coming down in the impact level, maybe we're just doing an upgrade to servers. So you still need to have a basic business case saying why are we doing this and what's the return. But portfolio management may not necessarily be involved in that type of change because it's not significantly affecting the customer-facing part of the service delivery. It's more of an internal efficiency and maintenance type of activity. So that would be a case where we don't talk about the benefits so much coming out of portfolio management. It's coming out of another type of maybe a technical department's business case assessment.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the last piece of the presentation today is just the authorization model. And again, it's something which we've always talked about, but they didn't have it diagrammatically correct in the previous version. So I'll give you the same test, Rick. Where do you think our update is in the authorization model?
I think, again, I'm pretty good with my colors, so I think the tan-colored box shows change management, and it moves local authorization down one level.
Yeah. I don't know why they missed this in the previous version, but they're updating the books and so on. All of my standard changes are down here at level 5. It's local authorization. So this is the way it should be. And then you get your normal changes that are coming into the change process. They're fairly low risk, small type of changes. And the change manager by themselves can say, okay, well, this doesn't require a big stakeholder meeting and review. In fact, they might be the type of changes that later on can become standard changes because they're low risk, frequent things. And again, we don't need anything but local decision making. So there always have been just an approval level with the change manager by themselves, where they just want to get simple and quick things out of the way because they don't have enough risk or impact to require stakeholder meetings. Then we get the standard. If it's a normal change with a bit more significant impact and so on, we move up to the CAB. Emergencies would be the ECAB. If it's bigger yet, so here's more or less the major changes, then we may have major changes link in here to the IT management board or some type of IT steering board. And if it's still more significant, this is affecting the strategies of the overall organization, you go up one more level and we add in the business executive board. And these aren't exclusive. As you go up, these are additions. So we start off, the change manager is always involved. If it's a bit more significant, then the CAB's involved and the change manager. If it's still more significant, the CAB, the change manager, and the IT steering board would be involved. And if it's one level more significant again, now we include the business executive board. So a clarification has always been there. It looks new in 2011, but really it's just a clarification of what's always been there, but diagrammatically wasn't shown before. So that's it. In terms of our presentation, you know, the flowchart diagram is really where you can see a lot of the improvements to the ITIL change process, and it's things that have been talked about. So has change really changed? The answer is no. It's always been sort of there and talked about, but it wasn't really shown that well, and it's just been clarified in the 2011 version. And hopefully the presentation today just kind of brought some of those clarifications and through the diagrams and just talking about major changes in general. You can kind of see where some of the clarification has come. So just a quick 3 points in the conclusion, and then we'll see if there's any more questions. So as I mentioned, change hasn't really changed. It's really the same thing. It's just been clarified. As always, not all changes are equal, and that's why they've made more emphasis on putting in a major change so that you can link the ITIL framework together a bit more and say, well, when it's more major, we need more portfolio management type of input, and that may include increasing the level of the CAB to the IT steering board or perhaps even the business executive board. And then the same old concept that's always been around, the bigger the change, the slower it moves and the more checks and balances you have. And again, a good clarification in our change process flow, the more authorization points you have as well. That you stop everyone after a certain amount of points, you have a very sober reflection of what's going on, and then you give authorization to go to the next piece of the build, test, and implement. So if you want to do a bit more reading on these things, you can go to our ThoughtRock website. You can just search on the contents. You know, I've got older presentations in there and blogs. You can just search on the keywords of change or release and development, any of the things you're looking for. And of course, we're always adding to the blogs and presentations over time. And we'll just see if there's any last-minute questions before we wrap it up. So, Rick, has anything come in?
There is one question, but before I do that, just before everybody else wraps up, I just wanted to again thank you again for a fantastic prescriptive session. I mean, that's the kind of education that we're looking for on ThoughtRock. And for those folks, again, who are coming back for next week, excuse me, it's Pete McGarrahan. And again, it's our industry best practices getting you the results you expected. So please keep an eye out for the weekly newsletter with more information. And also check into the ThoughtRock site to get more information on that session. So we hope to see you back. But again, for those folks that have to get going, we do appreciate you joining our session again today. And hopefully you've got what you needed out of this 45-minute session from Graham on Has Change Changed? And if you want to, you can stick around. There is one more question or a couple more questions here, but I just wanted to make sure we had wrapped up in case people do have to leave as it's getting close to 1 o'clock. So again, and we look for continued feedback on ideas for further comments, so further content. So please stay in touch with us. There is a slide at the end, as Graham has put up, that has contact information on there. You can use that. Many different ways to get in touch with us to reach out and give us some ideas. So thank you very much. For those that want to stick around for a couple more questions, we have another one, Graham, probably back to that the ITIL change authorization model screen that you had. And David was asking about things that were getting overly burdensome, and he was speaking of the added boards rather than using them as replacements. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, definitely I could talk to that. In terms of it becoming overly burdensome, I would disagree because a good change process, you know, that's one of the things the change manager should look for. When things are starting to become very bureaucratic and they're slowing down, that's a sign that more than likely, so you never know unless I'm in a situation I can evaluate it, but more than likely you've done something which has made it a bit more bureaucratic than it should be. So when it comes to maybe one of the things in the diagram that's getting a bit confusing for some people, when we're talking about the CAB plus the IT steering board plus the business executive board, it doesn't have to be a group sitting in a room or doing a regular conference call every day or every week. The whole purpose of the assessment part of the change process and the authorization steps is that it's dynamic. The size of the group gets bigger or smaller depending upon the size of your change. So in terms of, we call it standing bureaucracy or structure, when we have the cab should be stable. And it should include some of your key service management people who are going to be assessing all of these changes coming through the change process. So your change manager should always be part of the cab. Right? It's part of their job. It's part of the process. They sit in the cab and they convene the cab. And then you have other people who have the same vested interest. So the service desk manager, and you may have a separate incident manager. Right? They should be a part of that regular meeting as well, because 70 to 80% of changes result in some type of failure or questions coming from end users. So they should know what's going on in the organization, because change is happening all the time, and therefore incidents will happen all the time. Problem manager. If you have a problem process and a problem manager, they want to know, what's being discussed and what are things happening in the CAB meetings, because these may be things which I can pick up on to say these are trends and I should maybe investigate some of the problems. Service level managers may potentially be there, or service owners may be there because they want to know what's happening with services in general. So the cab is fixed, and you can include how big or small that is. There's a trend now a little bit that you have a business cab and a technical cab. They're kind of separating the two, and then they get together for different assessment purposes. So from that core group, then through conference calls or emails, whatever your escalation method is, that's when you would bring in the steering board and perhaps the business executive board. Right? They're brought in when they need to because, hey, we have a fairly major change here, or a business-altering change, and we need to have your input, because if it goes wrong, the more people who have input, at least everyone in the organization knows what's going on. They've had a chance to say, here's what needs to be done to be successful, and you have a better chance of not failing than you do of failing. And the worst kind of failure is the one where you fail and everyone's surprised. So hopefully that clarifies it a bit here. We're not talking about a massive regular scheduled meeting. This is just an expansion into other types of managerial levels who should be brought into the cab when needed. Okay, so any other questions?
Well, one's a comment. I think you can probably address it because I don't necessarily agree. Actually, unfortunately, the gentleman I think has left. He had to leave, but he posted a comment. I think it might be in other folks' heads that are from smaller organizations, in that he says he can only see very large companies even attempting this. V2 always the better way for smaller, agile companies. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, just based on the comment, my first thought, I would disagree, because it doesn't matter what the size, unless you're a one-person company. But all companies have owners and presidents, and then they have IT directors or managers, and then they have specific, let's call it change managers or technical managers. So in a small company, your cab could be just the technical manager and maybe a service desk manager, right? Two people sit in the cab and make up that structure. And then, again, when you get a more significant type of change, then they reach out and say, okay, well, I need my IT manager. You need to be brought into this conversation for the next hour on this change. And by the way, it's fairly significant, so let's bring the owner into the company because it's going to affect the business delivery. Right? So there you go. It's a small company, 4 people, and they're part of the overall change authority here.
Right. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think people get caught up in that this looks like, a crazy amount of resources required to deploy this, and I think the reality is these are best practices that can be deployed at a micro level. So thank you for that.
Yeah. They're all scalable.
And the better you do, we know as a small growing company that we were years ago, we know that if you don't build those sort of processes into your foundation, when you get larger, it is a worse mess to try to unwind. So it's better to do it when you're small and build from there.
Oh yeah, just to get the right habits in place.
Absolutely.
And then people
last one from Fred, and I know again we're sitting now on 12:59. So just a quick note from Fred is, Wouldn't level 1, 2 authorizations be done via release management process while level 3, 4 be done via change management?
I wouldn't argue against that. I don't see anything wrong with that. Release and deployment management is there to handle those more significant and bigger types of changes. So I totally am fine with that. Typically, the bigger the change, the more you bring in project management. The more you bring in project management, the more you include the business executive levels doing different reviews. So, yeah, part of this overall level in here, I would say you definitely want to bring in release and deployment management. And I won't get into a discussion about releases and changes and so on, but it totally makes sense here. And then when you get down to the level 3 and level 4, these are more perhaps small scale, less risky technical changes, just handled with the local technical department.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, that's an okay comment.
Excellent. We are at 1.00 and we need to close it out. So I appreciate all the questions that came through. If anybody has any outstanding questions, you have the contact information on the last slide that Graham just put up there. Please send them. We'll make sure Graham gets them, make sure he can answer any more additional questions that are out there hanging. We appreciate everybody, and the number of people that have stayed right till the end here is phenomenal. So Graham, kudos to you and the topic, and obviously it's a meaningful topic to many folks out there right now. There'll be many more like this to come. Please stay tuned for the content information that's coming out for our schedule for the next quarter. Lots of great stuff in the same in the areas of ITIL and change and problem and incident and so many more. Thanks again, Graham, and we're going fast here. We want to wrap up right at 1 o'clock. So thanks for everybody. We'll leave this slide up for a few more moments to get the contact information down. Graham, we'll see you soon.
Great. Well, thanks, Rick. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in the next round.